All right, it's showing live now.
Oh, it's showing live now. Great.
So,
It says done redirecting. And okay, I think we're live. So, hi everyone. Welcome to UMKC Political Science Quickbites. This is our new series that gives you a chance to get a little taster of an important political topic with answers from an expert. We're really hoping that people will enjoy this series, and we'd love to see your questions and comments and any suggestions for topics you'd like us to cover in subsequent series. I am Dr. Debra Leiter, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and I'm really honored to be joined today by my colleague, Dr. Greg Vonnahme, and I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce himself. So, hi, Dr. Vonnahme. Welcome.
well, thank you. It's nice to be joining everybody here. I am an associate professor of political science at UMKC and interim chair. I specialize in state politics and election administration.
Wonderful. Great. Well, Dr. Vonnahme, after all the questions about how we can vote in Wisconsin or Florida or here in Missouri, it kind of seems to me like everybody in the United States kind of votes a little differently. Is that true? And if so, why?
Almost everybody votes differently. So the reason that sometimes the conversations are difficult to follow is that election administration in the US is a highly decentralized process. So the federal government has very little to say about elections. They basically require that elections happen. They forbid discrimination along race and gender and set a minimum voting age, but that's about it. The federal government doesn't have much else to say about the way elections actually operate. States then are the next level of government, so the responsibility to determine election administration mostly falls on the states. States have mostly delegated that responsibility to counties. Some places, so if any of the viewers are in Kansas City, so some municipalities have election boards. So Kansas City has their own election board, but most places in the country, the primary election official that oversees the way people vote and how votes get initially tabulated is a county clerk. There are some limits on what they can do, but for the most part, we have about a little less than 3,100 counties in the US. So every election that we think of is essentially about 3,100 little micro elections with different technologies, different voting places, different voting practices, and different procedures.
Wow, 3,100. That's amazing. So you're telling me that someone in Johnson County, Kansas, who's right next door to Kansas City, might cast a totally different ballot and use a totally different system than someone right across the state border in Missouri in Kansas City?
They can vote at different times. Some states allow advance voting. Some states. So election day is always the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So that's been fixed by federal law since 1846, and that's always been the same. So that's not changing. But most states allow advance voting, where you can vote a number of days before. So in Kansas, they have 2 weeks of advance voting. Missouri has no formal advance voting system where you can go vote in person prior to election day or on election day. Polling places are open at different times. So some are 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., some are 7 to 8 p.m. So it varies from state to state when polling places are open. Rules for voting by mail. Missouri has a fairly restrictive, that's called absentee voting in most places. Missouri has a fairly restrictive absentee voting procedure, so you can vote by mail if you need to. Most states just let people vote by mail if you want to. You can just request one and then they'll send you a mail-in ballot. But even that varies from state to state. When they send the ballots varies. The structure of the ballot varies. And for anybody who votes in person, they will have different types of voting systems when they show up. There will be a different check-in system. So some of those are very automated. Some of those are still paper pencil. The automated ones use different technologies and different platforms. The actual voting system. So the three most common types of voting systems is you have vote by mail and absentee voting. People who vote in person will usually either vote on what's called a DRE. That's basically a touch screen, fully digitized, fully automated ballot. And the third most common today are optical scan voting machines. That's basically like taking a Scantron, where you just fill in bubbles or connect arrows or whatever it is. And then the paper ballot is fed into a machine, either precinct-based or centrally counted to actually tabulate the votes. Those are the three most common types of technology. Even within groups, you'll see variation. You'll see variation in structured mail ballots. There are about half a dozen major different manufacturers. These are all private manufacturers of the DREs, the electronic voting systems. And they all vary based on features, based on user interface. And you also have different structures of the optical scan ballots.
Wow. So it sounds like I could move just a short distance and be casting quite a different ballot in quite a different lot of places. Given all these different options or election technologies, do you see any trends right now in the United States? Or are there any types of technologies that really seem to be the growth industry, so to speak?
So we're sort of at sort of the peak of a trend. So after the 2000 presidential election in Florida, I mean, elections are highly decentralized today. It was really the Wild West before 2000, and virtually nobody paid attention to how people voted. The Florida 2000 presidential election was obviously a debacle. Part of it was unavoidable. Any close election is going to draw an enormous amount of scrutiny. And in 2000, Al Gore lost to George Bush by 537 votes out of about 6 million votes. So the margin was razor thin. That's just unavoidable. Anytime you have a close election, there's just going to be an enormous amount of scrutiny. And any error, no matter how slight, every election is going to have errors. It's going to attract scrutiny.
Right.
Even within that context, the Florida election had major issues.
Right.
And the ballot technology that they were using. So one in particular that drew a lot of attention was the butterfly ballot, which was just a weirdly structured votomatic system where people were using some stylus to poke out holes next to candidates' names. After that experience, this is one of the instances when the federal government did step in to regulate voting. They passed the Help America Vote Act, which required modernization of voting technology. They provided a lot of funding for that, and that sort of initiated about a 15-year period of voter modernization, where we see the widespread and now today almost universal adoption of either electronic voting systems or the optical scan ballots. There's some concern among local election officials because those very early adopters of those technologies, which relied on federal funds to purchase that equipment, is reaching the end of its life cycle. And the federal government is not providing new money to replace those. So they're sort of stretching the life cycle of some of those technologies in some jurisdictions, which there's some concern that they may break down in the not too distant future. There are also trends towards what's called VVPAT. VVPAT is voter verifiable paper audit trail.
Got it.
You work it out. If you voted in Johnson County, so Johnson County is a place that recently adopted VVPAT. Just 2 or 3 years ago, they replaced their voting machines, which used to just be pure electronic voting systems, to now where they're still electronic voting systems, but alongside it prints out a list of your choices. You can't actually pull it out of there. It's behind glass, it's protected, but you can actually review that to make sure that the choices that you made in the machine is what's showing up on paper. So that's the voter verifiable paper audit. So the voter is verifying via paper that their vote is accurately recorded, which addresses some of the security concerns of electronic voting.
So does that mean that does the voter get basically a receipt in this VVAP, or is this something that is filed separately by the election board?
Yeah, you can just think of it like a receipt. So the voter gets a receipt, and some of them they print it out, some of them they don't. Either way, the voter, in theory, reviews those, and then if they say yes, this is how I voted, then that paper ballot either serves as the ballot or it serves as a security backup, where if they need to do a recount, they can pull the actual paper ballots.
So you said the word security, and we obviously have this interesting point right now where we have very old tech and very new tech. We have some concerns. Have you noticed, are there any, how big of a threat is the issue of voting security? And are any of these election technologies more vulnerable than others?
So a lot of this concern comes, so some of it comes up with especially the fully electronic voting systems. It's one of the reasons that a number of jurisdictions has favored optical scans, because the idea is that there's still a paper ballot there, there's still a backup. So if something goes wrong with the technology, you're not solely relying on it. You can see how people actually vote. That's one of the reasons why a lot of purely electronic voting systems have incorporated some form of VVPAT to provide that backup system. There are also systems that are like automarks, which is just an electronic way of filling out a paper ballot, which is essentially what VVPAT is.
Gotcha.
In terms of security, it's complicated. Security experts have successfully hacked all long-standing electronic voting systems as forms of adversarial testing. None of them have successfully withstood any effort. And this is in a mock election scenario, so you don't have like computer scientists running out there like stealing elections or anything like that.
They're very busy people,
right? Yeah, they've got a lot of those. In their free time, they'll but these are just tests, and the purpose is to understand and enable companies to fix important security flaws. But the security flaws are there. We have no known record of any significant and successful widespread hacking of electronic voting systems. So we know of no election that has been affected or overturned as a result of electronic voting systems. It's one of the things, security is probably the number one thing that has prevented more movement on internet voting. And there is a little bit of movement on internet voting, especially for overseas and military populations. But other than that, internet voting, some parties have done it in primaries on a test basis. But we've seen very little movement towards internet voting, primarily because of security issues. What seems to be, and that's just the technology. In addition to the technology, what is probably the largest security concern is the human component. Right. So you always have people behind the systems who may be careless with passwords, who may be susceptible to phishing schemes, which permit them unauthorized access into voting systems. And no matter how good the tech is, no matter how good sort of the security apparatus is, if we don't have that robust human element on the back end, you're still going to face security flaws. So we began the discussion with this idea of a highly decentralized system of elections. That's one of the key features behind the robustness of American security. It's true.
Yeah.
Because if you want to hack an election, hacking an election isn't hacking an American election. It's basically hacking 3,100 little micro elections that are all doing things a little bit different with different technologies and different types of ballots, which would just make it extraordinarily difficult from the perspective of a malicious actor and builds in a certain level of robustness. And we might look at it and say, that's crazy, but it's not entirely disadvantageous to run elections.
So we have this sort of trade-off between these election technologies being so varied that they're challenging to hack, but also potentially challenging to implement. I was thinking about Iowa and the app problems there. Do you see those kind of technology issues becoming more common as new technologies are implemented, or do you think that Iowa is more of an exception than a rule in this case?
That was an exception. That was an exceptional case. Then in hindsight, they should have known better. And I mean, they were really, I mean, the Iowa caucuses themselves are sort of a strange party function that, I mean, any election, most of your election workers, and if anybody out there is listening has any interest in being a poll worker, please do. Local election officials are short on poll workers almost everywhere. especially if you're younger and somewhat more comfortable around technology, please volunteer. You do get paid, but it's mostly volunteer work. You don't get paid a lot to be able to. Please do that. There's about 8 hours of training that goes into being a poll worker, and that's it. So when you go vote in person, it's not like there's a crack team of election experts that you're working with. I mean, these are really neighborhood-based precinct operations. Somebody down the street wants to do their civic duty and shows up and runs a polling site. That's in a normal election.
Gotcha.
The Iowa caucuses, I mean, that's really it's like the local dentist who, just shows up and counts ballots, and they have a complicated way of translating people actually show up voting into delegate equivalents, and then they tried to automate that. I mean, they should have known that was a problem.
Right.
Sometimes it's happened before. It's happened in Denver, a number of years ago when they adopted a new system of checking in voters, but there was a technological failure that slowed down the processing of registered voters that led to like 7-hour-long lines and things like that. So I mean, cases like that do happen, but it's pretty unusual. And if anything, I think they're getting better at managing and deploying new technology, in particular testing them in low level, like local elections, school board elections, making sure things work sort of okay before they run it out in like a big federal election, like in 2020. I think the big question in terms of election administration for 2020 will be vote by mail.
Right.
What happens if social distancing is in place? And that's less sort of there's no real, the technology doesn't really affect that. And that's just a question of how do we vote? How do we lay out our polling places? And if we can't vote in person, can we vote remotely by mail?
Right. And it sounds like from what you said before that because this is so localized, states that it's the choice of the states to implement voting by mail or not?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
And five states currently have all vote by mail. Oregon has had all vote by mail since 1988, which is 32 years ago. So they haven't voted in person for a very long time.
And they've been successful at that? Do we see that Oregon has low turnout or anything like that?
There's a real debate as to whether or not so the academic consensus is that vote by mail significantly increases turnout in local elections. And the idea is that a lot of people just forget there's a local election until a ballot pops up in the mail. And they're like, look at that, there's an election coming up, I'll fill it out. I mean, you'll see a 15 to 25% increase in local election turnout.
Wow.
I mean, it's big. There's real debate about whether or not it matters.
Okay.
For federal elections,
right?
Which is more high profile. Turnout seems to be pretty consistent. You might see maybe a 1 or 2% increase in voter turnout, but it's pretty negligible. Voter satisfaction. I mean, voters tend to really like it. So once they get it, states don't move away from it. Local election officials also like it because it's a lot easier to administer and a lot less expensive to administer.
So there's a cost saving as well. I didn't realize that. Yeah. We had some interesting questions on our Facebook Live from Nolan Perlew, who is interested in whether state systems are really prepared for any type of cyber attack. Do you see some states more prepared than others?
That is a good question. So I guess I would approach it in two ways. So after the 2016 election, there was concern about the security of voter registration databases. And there were a number of attacks and attempted attacks on voter registration systems. Those seem like they were like access attacks, like they were trying to get access to the voter registration databases. Why would they want that? I have no idea. What would they do with it? Most of these you can just buy,
right.
So it's.
I believe it's a $15 CD for the Kansas City Election Board registration of records.
Yeah, it's $15 in Kansas City. That also varies state by state. Like Alabama at one time was charging like $1,500.
Ooh.
there are all kinds of weird restrictions on who can get it, but by and large, that's publicly available information. There's no indication that there was any remotely close to successful hacking attempt that would actually change voter registration systems.
Okay.
And those would be thoroughly backed up. So I would say the likelihood that anybody could get in there, change something, and get out in an undetected way that would affect elections would be in the list of things that worry me about elections. I mean, that'd be pretty far down the list. Could there be hacking efforts against technology about the actual votes, right? So we sort of have that two-tiered system: voter registration, actual turnout. The threat could be greater. Would that be greater for certain states or localities? Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Sure.
Certainly certain systems, certain individual voting systems are more susceptible or less susceptible than others. But that just depends. That's largely a county level decision. States certify a number of machines that local governments can use, but then it's up to the local governments. Certainly studies show that where we see newer equipment and better equipment tends to be in places where you'd expect it. Places that have a more affluent tax base, and for local governments, that's property taxes, and that means where you have more affluent populations.
That's really good to know. Well, I want to keep this. I want to keep this quick. I want to thank everyone who has asked us questions. We ended up hitting a few of them. So, Dr. Vonnahme, I think a lot of people are really interested in this. Do you have any research you'd like to tell people about, or any classes that they might be able to take soon that might allow them to learn a little bit more about this subject?
Sure. So in terms of elections, if anybody's interested in election administration, the Pew Charitable Trust operates an aggregator called electionline.org. So you can just Google election line and you can get access to there's a lot, access to all of the news covering election administration. It is statewide across all 50 states. The Pew Charitable Trust has also had an initiative on making voting work, which produced a number of studies about election administration. So those are good resources. In terms of courses, things are still a little bit taking shape.
Sure.
But I am hoping to teach a projects-based class on election administration that will look at the ways that local jurisdictions and states address voting in a time of potential lockdowns and a pandemic, and whether they're more or less successful in doing so. There's not a lot of guidance. We have had some jurisdictions face voting disruptions because of hurricanes and other natural disasters, which will provide some guidance as to how to conduct an election. But otherwise, that's a very open question.
Well, that sounds great. Well, if you want to learn more about the class offerings that we have about election administration, tune in here to the UMKC Facebook page, or the UMK Political Science Facebook page, or the UMKC Political Science Twitter to learn more. I want to thank Dr. Vonnahme for joining us today for the UMKC Poli-Sci Quickbites. We're going to be bringing more of these to you folks as we go through. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. And we'll see you next time. We hope this has whetted your political science appetite. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Leiter, and also thank you, Nolan. I hope this finds you well, and appreciate the question.
Great. All right. Bye, everyone.